Hello, my name is Dan Corrali and I work in Optiv's Research and Development Group. This is part 3 of a video series covering a way in which automated endpoint evaluations can be achieved, completed using Power Automate, Azure Automation, and Mandiant Security Validation. In the last video, we left off our Power Automate flow with the creation of our Azure Resource Group and our RDP Security Group. This was accomplished using a PowerShell script that was called by Azure Automation as an action in this flow. With our resource group defined, now let's continue to step through this flow. Let's create our VM. We're going to rename this host, and I'm going to assign it one of 3 predefined public IP addresses. And then in the 4th video, what I'm going to cover is how to dynamically install endpoint sensors, the Mandiant security validation sensor on the host to perform the actual efficacy testing. So this is the flow that we left off on. The last step that we went over in the previous video was the create job. This was the resource group that we created. Now we have a few extra steps down here, and apply to each on the bottom is going to be the longest. But we have this initialized node step, which I'll cover in the next video. The node is the ID of the host that we're actually going to run efficacy tests against. We also need to call out which vendor sensor we want to install. And since this is going to be done dynamically, meaning it can be one of several vendors, we have a regular expression match that is very similar to the one that we used before with IP or test name. This one is vendor. So we can pull out the vendor information from the email, and that's going to be used as a variable as well as a parameter in some of our Azure automation scripts. And for each vendor that's extracted, we're going to perform this last action, which is actually a bunch of actions under the VM creation action. So let me shrink these down, and I will expand this last action. The last action is an apply to each, and it's just named VM creation. For every match that we have, for every vendor match, we're going to perform all of these actions. The first action here is create vendor VM. And this is actually an Azure automation job, and we're setting the parameters of owner, vendor, IP, and test name in this runbook, create vendor VM. And what that looks like under the hood is right here. This is our PowerShell script. These are the parameters that we're using, that we're extracting as the variables from the previous step. These are authentication steps. Obviously, the information is removed for the demo, but you would need to input your own. Beneath our authentication, we're dynamically assigning some resource information. So you can see our resource group has the owner and then the test name parameters that are actually extracted from the email. This has been used in some of the previous scripts that I went over as well. All of this information is done with the information that's inputted from the email. We need to assign it a network. We need to perform disk creation. The disk creation for this VM, it's actually a little different than creating a brand new disk because we're using a snapshot of another machine as the disk image for this VM. And that's because there's some software on there that I like to use for some of the actions found in Mandiant Security Validation. After that, we have our NIC creation, virtual machine object. We're adding a network interface. We're adding the OS to disk. And then we're going to assign the network to the NIC. All basic information that needs to be done in order for a VM creation as well as for that VM to have network access. So that is all accomplished in this action here. The next thing we're going to do is rename the host that we just created. It's got a base name, this is fine, but one of the problems I ran into when I installed Carbon Black or CrowdStrike sensors, etc., is that if multiple people were running evaluations at the same time, because we create those VMs with the same template name, we're going to have multiple VMs or multiple sensors reporting the same name into the Falcon console or Carbon Black console. And it becomes really confusing to understand which host belongs to which owner and which eval. So I needed to figure out a way to change that name. So what I came up with is this action here. And this is another Azure automation action that gets triggered. And under that Azure automation action is just a PowerShell script. What that PowerShell script looks like, let me go to it here. So here is our Azure Automation PowerShell Runbook. We have to define parameters, owner, vendor, and our test name. We have to define the VM that we're looking to change the host name of. Tell the script which resource we're looking to change the name of, that resource or that VM in which resource group. That information is dynamically defined by the email that's sent. Lines 13 through 17 are our authorization. And then we're going to create a script here. This script is going to be created in memory. It's going to be written to script.txt. That script.txt file is going to consist of whatever name the test name is, -rd, and that's how we're going to rename our endpoint. And then we're also going to create a PowerShell script that is going to use the contents of that script.txt file. That script executing on the endpoint is what is going to rename the host for us. How we do that is with another PowerShell command that allows us to execute the script that is created in memory against the endpoint, and that script tells the machine to rename itself. Let's take a look at a completed flow or a successful flow and take a look at some of the outputs associated with that. So we can see we have green check marks in all of our actions. So everything executed successfully. Let's take a look at the test name used. So here we have submitted the test name as eval2. We're going to look for a specific vendor. Oh, bear with me for one moment. We have submitted CrowdStrike as the vendor in the email. So now that we have a vendor and the evaluation or test name as eval2, we're going to take a look at what creating the VM and what renaming the host look like. So here we can see that we're waiting for the job to succeed so it doesn't move on to the next action. And we could also see on the bottom it says status completed. Let's go over to the resource group associated with this particular run. So here we're going to go to Portal. Oh, I have it up on a tab here. Perfect. So we can see that my last name, eval2 resource group, has been created. And when I log in, I can see that I have my last name and then CrowdStrike as a secondary term for every resource, as well as for our particular VM. So let's click on this. We're going to see that I have a computer name of eval2-rd, and here is our public IP address that was assigned. And before I RDP to that machine, let's take a look at the next action, and that's going to be assign allowed IP address. That is another Azure automation action, which is a PowerShell script under the hood. And this is going to allow our VM or assign it one of three different IP addresses. These IP addresses are already existing in another resource group. So here we examine the script. We have our parameters. We have our authentication. We're defining some resources. On the 20th line, we're going to see allow IP, and I had named it Veridin allowed IP address. This is an IP address that we've had for some time. It's old. We're using it to allow access from the outside in through our firewall. We also have another one here on line 40 that is named allowed to. the second IP address allowed through the firewall. There's going to be a failure if it's already assigned. And then we also have allowed 3. And if none of those IPs are available, it'll say job failed. All public IPs are in use, meaning they're being assigned or are assigned to other VMs in other evaluations. All 3 of those IP addresses are already created. They're in this research group. And let's go to that research resource group. And you're going to see right there, this is our research resource group. I have a Veridan allowed IP address that is allowed through the firewall. I have this allowed 2 as well as the allowed 3. These are already existing. And what we're going to do is when this script runs, we're going to attempt to apply one of those IP addresses to that newly created VM. Let's jump back over to the VM. Again, the 20 dot is our public IP address. I was automatically allowed to RDP to this by the security group that was created in our resource group and security or RDP security group that was set up in one of our first actions in this flow. Let me put the computer name, the IP address there, and then it's just going to be Azure user for this example, for this demo. And when I connect to it, I have a password that already exists on the box, part of that snapshot that we used to create the VM disk. And now I'm going to be able to show you that the host name has changed. And I'll just do a quick on-box confirmation of that using PowerShell. Let me just type host name here. Perfect. So eval2-rd, because that is the test name that we submitted. The -rd gets appended. We can see it right in the upper right too, with the info that's displayed on the desktop. All of which I think is very cool, all of which gets done automatically with no human interaction. And just to take it a step further, kind of as a little teaser for the next video here, you're going to see right there. Let me go back down. CrowdStrike Windows Sensor was also installed. It was installed using Azure Container Storage and a couple of invoke azvm run commands. But I also want to go over to our Falcon host search dashboard and show you not only have we changed the host name, have we automatically or dynamically assigned an IP address from our allowed group, but that host has the CrowdStrike Windows sensor on it, and it's reporting back to Falcon with the eval2-rd host name. Perfect. So we can see the host that we searched for, eval2-rd. It's got our public IP address that was assigned to us by our automation runbook. And we can see that it's a Microsoft virtual machine. Let's close everything out, and I think this leaves us in a good place to stop for video 3. We got the host name assigned, the IP address, and in part 4 and probably part 5, we will cover the rest of this flow. Thanks again for listening in on part 3 of automated endpoint evaluations. Videos 4 and 5 should be out shortly. If you need reference to any of the scripts that were talked about today, below on our GitHub link is where you can find them. Thank you.